Adam Higginbotham, Midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster. Delve into the dark history of the world's most devastating nuclear catastrophe with Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. In an ambitious quest to meet electricity needs and compete with the West, the Soviet Union launched an ambitious nuclear reactor program in the 1970s, culminating in the construction of the Chernobyl atomic energy station in Ukraine. Uncover the secretive and hazardous development process of the RBMK reactor, the initial success of the nuclear industry, followed by a shocking shift to cost-cutting and cover-ups. The book reveals the tragic events leading up to the explosion of reactor number 4 and the ensuing political and ecological fallout.
Soviet nuclear dreams. In the early 1970s, the Soviet Union launched an ambitious program of building nuclear reactors to meet its electricity needs and compete with Western countries. Despite being world leaders in nuclear engineering, they fell behind the United States during the era of stagnation. Their new project aimed to establish them as the dominant force in nuclear power, with plans to build the greatest nuclear power station on Earth in Chernobyl, Ukraine. However, behind all the failures of the USSR was the monolithic power of the Communist Party, breeding inefficiencies and waste throughout the planned economy. Chernobyl's nuclear ambition. The Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station was Ukraine's first nuclear power plant, designed with an ambitious schedule to meet the country's energy demands. Viktor Brukhanov, the plant's sole employee, worked tirelessly to create the infrastructure and install the new and powerful RBMK reactor model. The plant's success was crucial, but the deadlines set by Moscow and Kiev were impossible to meet. Despite the pressure, the first reactor was scheduled to go online at the end of 1975, in time to fuel the country's growing energy needs. The nuclear ambition of USSR. The Soviet Union's nuclear work was led by an atomic politburo under the supervision of Lavrentiy Beria. In 1949, they detonated the first atomic bomb, using a plutonium core created in the reactor Anushka. By 1952, they inaugurated the Scientific Research and Design Institute of Energy Technology to create civilian reactors. Physicist Igor Kurchatov headed an ambitious program of experimental reactor technology, aiming for nuclear reactors, cheap electricity, and nuclear-powered transportation. After Kurchatov's death in 1960, reactors became more cheaply made, and the Soviet regime became more secretive. The USSR never reported nuclear accidents despite their participation in the International Atomic Energy Agency. In 1957, a major explosion occurred in a reactor in the southern Urals, and the truth about the severity of the accident remained hidden for decades, as it was the worst nuclear accident in history for many years. The Soviet Union's nuclear misstep. The RBMK reactor was a symbol of Soviet engineering's ambition, but it was also its Achilles heel. Created without a prototype, the reactor design was riddled with errors, making it prone to explosions. Despite alarming warnings from dissenting scientists, the government approved its construction. The core, made of 1,700 tons of graphite blocks, was surrounded by a tank of water capped with iron shot and the mineral serpentine. Boron carbide rods controlled the reactor's nuclear chain reaction. Serious design flaws became apparent as soon as construction began, but engineers pushed the reactor into mass production without a successful prototype. This misstep would lead to one of the world's most catastrophic nuclear accidents, Chernobyl. The Chernobyl Disaster. In 1986, a poorly executed safety test resulted in the explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The staff attempted to revive the contaminated reactor using manual control rods, which caused a sudden and uncontrollable spike in reactivity. The reactor exploded with the force of over 50 tons of dynamite, completely destroying it. Tons of uranium fuel and graphite blocks were scattered into the air in a radioactive cloud, and 1,300 tons of radioactive rubble caught fire. The disaster was a tragic reminder of the importance of following nuclear safety protocols and effectively managing emergencies. Chernobyl Disaster. At 1:30 a.m., a devastating explosion rocked Chernobyl, causing a raging fire that released radioactive particles into the air. The blast destroyed the control room and reactor, leaving a shimmering column of blue-white light. Meanwhile, senior staff members at the plant struggled to comprehend the scope of the disaster, leading to delays in evacuation orders. It was not until 32 hours later that a public statement was made about the accident, and the nearby town of Pripyat was finally evacuated. Disaster averted. In an attempt to put out the radioactive fire at the Chernobyl reactor, scientists tried numerous substances, but none were available nearby. Pilots and engineers from the 51st Guards Helicopter Regiment repeatedly dropped bags of boron and sand to stop chain reactions and dull the flames. Sandbags were used to prevent the release of radioactive gases. The powder boron was also bombarded on the site authorities. Amidst all the chaos and fear, the deserted town of Pripyat was filled with howling dogs and the sound of helicopters. Fortunately, all efforts paid off, and a massive disaster was averted. Chernobyl Disaster. In April 1986, a nuclear accident occurred at the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine. A cloud of radioactive material containing xenon-133, iodine-131, cesium-137, and pieces of radioactive graphite rose to 1,500 meters high and spread across the Soviet Union and Baltic Sea. The Soviet government was slow to admit to the disaster, and it was not until abnormal levels of radiation were reported in Scandinavia that they released a statement. At an emergency meeting of the Politburo, Gorbachev insisted on an immediate government statement, but the government's tendency towards secrecy prevailed. The official press release admitted to only 2 deaths and the evacuation of Pripyat, but not the radiation's extent. The New York Post published unconfirmed reports of up to 15,000 dead. The accident served as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear power and the importance of transparency and accountability. Chernobyl Trial and Recovery. The trial of plant director Viktor Brukhanov and 5 others responsible for the Chernobyl disaster took place in Chernobyl due to the contaminated exclusion zone. The trial found everyone guilty, with senior officials receiving a 10-year sentence. Meanwhile, the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station underwent months of decontamination and repair, and 3 surviving reactors went back online on December 4, 1987. However, the exclusion zone remained contaminated 25 years after the reactor's destruction. The press was only allowed to hear opening and closing remarks.
In Midnight in Chernobyl, Adam Higginbotham paints a harrowing picture of the disastrous consequences resulting from the Soviet Union's ambitious nuclear program, reckless cost-cutting measures, and unrelenting secrecy. Gain insight into the aftermath of the Chernobyl explosion, its impact on local communities, and the attempts to contain the crisis. Despite the horrible destruction of reactor number 4 and crippling long-term effects, the Soviet government's secretive nature persisted. Today, the exclusion zone surrounding the power plant remains contaminated, serving as a chilling reminder of the catastrophic risks that come with nuclear energy mishandling and heinous cover-ups.